Hello everyone, and welcome back to Queen Elizabeth, A Day in Her Life. In our last episode, the King and Queen were doing all they could to keep the public's resolve up. Churchill was the new Prime Minister, and at first the King couldn't picture him in that position. The more time that the King spent with him, though, the more he came to find out that Churchill was the right person for the job. The Queen was busy with women's causes and kept the ladies' morale up in England as well as in France. So let's see what they're up to today. During those trying months, thousands of children were being evacuated from major cities in the anticipation of the German bombing. Most were sent to the country, but the rich started to send them either to the United States or to the Dominions. The King and Queen were wondering about their own kids. The King asked Churchill if he thought the princesses would be a liability in the event of an invasion, and the Prime Minister said no. The Queen didn't have any doubts. She said, "The children could not go without me, and I could not possibly leave the King, and the King would never go." The royal family and their security was a concern even so. One time King Haakon asked the King what would happen if the German parachutists suddenly came into the grounds of the palace. The King's biographer wrote the following: "Obligingly, King George pressed the alarm signal, and together with the Queen they went into the garden to watch the result. There followed an anticlimax which was nothing at all. To summarize, the equerry was dispatched to make inquiries, returned a report of that to the officer of the guard, and then informed the police sergeant on duty that no attack was pending. Then a number of guardsmen entered the garden and started to beat the undergrowth. As a result of this incident, precautions were revised and strengthened. They had the Coates mission created. This was a hand-picked body of officers from the Brigade of Guards and the Household Cavalry, who had armored cars, and they stood always ready to take the King and Queen to a secret place of safety in the country, should the Germans really threaten them. At Buckingham Palace, the first air raid shelter wasn't really much protection against a direct hit. It was a basement room which had been used by a housekeeper. The ceiling was reinforced by steel girders, and there was now steel shutters across the high window. The furniture was gilt chairs, a Regency settee, and large Victorian mahogany table. The shelter was decorated with many valuable small Dutch landscapes, paintings that had been brought downstairs. The Queen hated the shelter and later said that she developed an unreasonable dislike for those little scenes of cows and bridges over canals. Emergency steps were made to reach the window. Axes were put on the wall, oil lamps, electric torches, a bottle of smelling salts, and a pile of glossy magazines to help them be entertained. The room next door of the household would shelter there and had a piano, but the King wasn't amused when one of the refugee courtiers attempted a rousing sing-song. The Queen's dressers and the other staff had another nearby room where many of the palace priceless clocks had been moved for safekeeping. The loud ticking was a useful distraction to those waiting for the bombs to drop. The rats were another less welcome diversion. Throughout the summer, there were daily dogfights across the skies, and the Queen continued to visit to troops, hospitals, voluntary services, factories, aerodromes, and training centers. She did more than 20 solo engagements in June and July, and another 10 with the King. On July 31st, she visited the Free French troops under the leadership of Charles de Gaulle. De Gaulle wasn't an easy ally, but he soon became something of a favorite with her. For the first time in their married life, there was no holiday in Scotland that year. The Queen celebrated her birthday on August 4th in a low-key manner. Hitler's dash across Europe led to new, more serious concerns about the Duke of Windsor. With the approval of the British military mission to which he was attached, he left Paris as the Germans advanced in May. He and the Duchess paused briefly in the south of France before having to flee the advancing Germans into Spain on the night of June 20th. Berlin had ambitions for the Duke. Ribbentrop, the former ambassador to London, and now the German foreign minister, knew the Duke was sympathetic to Germany and that he considered the war unnecessary. The fascist government of General Franco was aligned with Berlin, and the Germans tried to have the Duke detained in Spain. Churchill was concerned and telegraphed the Duke, asking him to move at once to neutral Lisbon, and then a flying boat would carry him and the Duchess back to England. The Duke's reply was that he insisted that before he was returned, he would be given guarantees that he and the Duchess would be royally treated in England and would be extended regular invitations to Buckingham Palace. So this was a nerve to badger the Prime Minister during a time when Britain faced immediate invasion, as his biographer put it, conduct that could not be condoned. The Windsors ended up going to Lisbon, but even there were German conspiracies. Ribbentrop first sent the men to flatter the Duke with praise and promises, and then an SS soldier was there on a mission to cajole and, even if necessary, force the Duke back to Spain. English intelligence stated that Germans expected assistance from the Duke and Duchess of Windsor, the Duchess desiring at any price to become queen, and Germans had been negotiating with her since June 27th. Churchill then came up with the idea of getting the Duke and Duchess far away from German reach by sending them to the Bahamas. They would make the Duke governor there. The royal family didn't really like the idea. The king wrote his mother, "I at once said that it would be an obstacle as Dee's wife. None of the family wanted the Windsors in England at this time, and the king said to Queen Mary it was imperative to get him away from Lisbon." Queen Mary was equally unenthusiastic, but she replied, "Under the circumstances, I think this is the best arrangement for Dee." Queen Elizabeth had the greatest misgivings, and she expressed them clearly in a handwritten memorandum. She wrote that she was certain that if the Duke was made governor of the Bahamas, a very difficult situation would arise over his wife. Home and marriage ties were sacred to the average Britons, and the fact that the Duchess has 3 husbands alive will not be pleasing to the good people of the islands. She said Britons were used to looking up to the king's representatives, but the Duchess of Windsor is looked upon as the lowest of the low. It will be first lowering standard set and may lead to unimaginable troubles. The Queen said her views were not personal, and she thought it might displease Americans, which might be dangerous. Hardinge told her that he knew that Lord Lloyd, like most others, shared her views, but the appointment was a lesser evil than the only other alternative, the Windsors' return to Britain. They told her that I think that she will do harm wherever she is, but there's less scope for it in a place like Bahamas than elsewhere, and the native population probably would not understand what it's all about. The Duke kept making demands. He insisted that his former servants be released from active service to accompany him to the Bahamas, and that he and the Duchess be allowed to visit New York on their way. Churchill refused to allow them the New York visit, and he reluctantly agreed that one valet be discharged in order to be returned to him. Things were not certain about their departure. The Germans told the Duke that the British Secret Service was planning to assassinate him on the voyage, and that he'd be safer under the German wing in Spain. It took another visit from Walter Monckton to convince him to leave. He and the Duchess finally set sail on August 1st. It's not known if the Duke would have cooperated with the Nazis. On one occasion, the king wrote, "Winston told me that David's ideas and his pro-Nazi leanings would have been impossible during the crisis of the last 3 years. That was true, but it doesn't mean he would have committed treason." The Duke's biographer said the Duke did think that Britain would lose the war, but if the Germans had victory, the Duke's belief in the British meant that he could not have allowed himself to rule by favor of the Germans over a sullen and resentful people. While the Duke and Duchess sailed west, Hitler started his assault of air power over Britain to break their will and ability to resist a seaborne invasion. The campaign had begun in early July with bombing raids on the south coast ports and gathered in intensity, spreading through the southeast and on to London. Hitler knew that no invasion could take place until the Germans controlled the air over Britain and the English Channel. For 10 days, the bright and sunny skies over southeastern England were filled with the roar of warfare. Wave after wave of German bombers flew across the coast towards London, and young men in their Spitfires and Hurricanes rose up to shoot them down. It was a deadly time in this new phase of the Battle of Britain. August 8th, the Luftwaffe began an attack on airfields and aircraft factories and managed to bomb them out of action. The last week of August and the first week of September 1940, there were 600 enemy aircraft attacking Britain every day. In those 2 weeks, the Royal Air Force lost 290 aircraft. On the night of September 7th, 200 German bombers broke through the Royal Air Force defenses and hit London, killing 300 people and injuring over 1,300 more in the next few hours. The docks in the East End were set alight, and hundreds of fires attracted swarm after swarm of enemy aircraft. That night, to add to the horror, the chiefs of staff issued the code word Cromwell. An invasion was thought to be imminent. This went on night after night. By the middle of the month, more than 2,000 civilians had been killed and 8,000 wounded. most in London itself. The courage of the Royal Air Force was extraordinary and gave Britain victory. They resisted the Luftwaffe, and the bad weather of September came, and Hitler had to postpone Operation Sea Lion, which was the invasion of Britain. The bombings didn't stop. It went on week after week, and London was raided again and again and again. September 8th, Buckingham Palace got a direct hit. A delayed reaction bomb was dropped. It didn't explode, and the next morning the king worked in his office above where it lay. In the middle of Monday night, it went off, blowing out all the windows of his office and many others, and damaged the indoor swimming pool. Some of the palace ceilings came down, but the main structure was intact. The following week, the king and queen made their first visits to the East End, which was devastated. They were given emotional welcomes by the people, picking up the rubble with cheerfulness. They had lost everything, but were determined to try and rebuild their homes and their lives. The king and queen, walking among them, made them feel reassured. The king wrote Queen Mary, "We have seen some of the awful havoc which has been done in East London, and have talked to the people, who are quite marvelous in the face of adversity, so cheerful about it all, and some have had very narrow escapes." On the morning of September 13th, the king and queen were almost killed. It was a deliberate attack. A German bomber emerged from a low cloud, flew straight up the mall, and dropped a stick of bombs on the palace. The queen and king had gotten back to Buckingham Palace at 10:45 a.m., and they went up to the windowless rooms to collect a few odds and ends. Then there was an air raid in progress, and the queen went to find the king and see if he was going to go down to the shelter. The king asked the queen to take an eyelash out of his eye, and she was doing that when the secretary came into the room with a batch of papers in his hand. Then they heard the whir-whir of German airplanes, and they said, a German. And before anything else could be said, there was the noise of aircraft diving at great speed and the scream of a bomb. The queen said it happened so quickly that they only had time to look at each other. The scream hurled past them and exploded with a tremendous crash in the quadrangle. The queen saw a lot of smoke, and the earth was thrown up in the air, and they all went into the corridor and ducked. There was another tremendous explosion, and the king and queen and two pages who were outside the door stayed for a few moments on the corridor away from the staircase in case of flying glass. The queen said they remained wonderfully calm, and they went down to the shelter. The queen went along to see if the housemaids were all right, and they were busy in their various shelters. Then there was a cry for bandages and the first aid party. That first aid party had been training for a year and did great. They treated the 3 people injured. And those 3 people were working below the chapel, and the queen said how they survived, I don't know. Their whole workshop was in shambles. The bomb had gone through the floor above them. The queen said her knees trembled a little bit for a minute or two after the explosions. Afterwards, her and the king felt well, though just a bit tired after their ordeal. And the queen was pleased with the servants. They were magnificent, she said. The French cook was still cooking after the bomb went by, and he told the queen that he had an unshakable conviction that France would rise again. The king and the queen decided not to tell anyone they had nearly died, even Churchill. Later, Churchill wrote that had the windows been closed instead of open, the whole of glass would have splintered in the faces of the king and queen, causing terrible injuries. Their near escape wasn't made public until the end of the war. The king and queen had lunch the day of the bombing, and then they went back to East London once again. The queen was horrified and moved, and she told the Queen Mary, that is, that the damage was ghastly. She said she felt like she was walking in a dead city, and when they walked down the empty streets. All the houses were evacuated, and through the broken windows one could see their poor little possessions, photographs, beds, just as they were left. At the end of the street was a school which was hit and collapsed on top of 500 people waiting to be evacuated, and 200 were still under the ruins. The queen said it affected her seeing the senseless destruction, and she minded it more than being bombed herself. She said to Queen Mary, the people are marvelous and full of fight, and she said we must win in the end. The queen wrote to Queen Mary, darling Mama, I do hope that you will let me come and stay a day or two later. It's so sad being parted, as this war has parted families. With love and prayers for your safety, ever darling Mama, your loving daughter-in-law, Elizabeth. P.S. Dear old Buckingham Palace is still standing, and that is the main thing. I will stop the video here. In this episode, things got ramped up. The palace worked on an air raid shelter. People were evacuating. The rich were sending their kids to either the Dominions or to the United States. The queen didn't want her kids too far away from her, and she wasn't going to leave the king, and the king wasn't going to leave the country, so they would all be in England. And there was a scare when a bomb landed at Buckingham Palace. It was a delay bomb, and it landed just above the king's office. And that night it exploded, and luckily no one was in the room. It sounded so scary the way the planes came in low, and then the screams of the bombs. It sounded like East London got the worst of it, and it made the queen upset that there was so much damage done there. She said it saddened her more than if she had been bombed. The Duke was being bossy once more. He was in France, and with the fall of France, he had to get out. At first they had him go to Spain, but they were afraid the Nazis could get to him, so they got him to Lisbon. The Nazis were trying to flatter the Duke, and then they started to plant seeds that the English Secret Service planned to assassinate him. Luckily, he was convinced to get on the boat, and he was sent to the Bahamas to be governor there, even though the Queen Mother wasn't too happy about it, but it was either there or have him and the Duchess go back to England, and that wasn't too great an option either. I can't imagine how terrifying it must have been for everyone during those dark days of constant bombing and not having anyone to help out at that moment. The king and queen kept everyone's spirits up, and I admire the grit of the English people to keep on fighting. It's an inspiration. I hope you enjoyed the video, and if you did, if you could give it a thumbs up, it would help out the channel and make me feel that I'm doing things right on my videos. And I appreciate all of you who have taken time to comment and let me know that you look forward to my videos. That means a lot to me. And I wish everybody a good day, and tune in again soon for another episode of Queen Elizabeth, A Day in Her Life. Thank you. Bye.